I'm very excited to introduce tonight's presenter. David Kaufman is a longtime professor of American Jewish Studies, having served on the faculties of the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles and Hofstra University on Long Island. He is the author of two books, Shul with a Pool in 1999 and Jewhooing the 60s in 2012, and is currently engaged with the development of a public history organization called New York Jew, Center for New York Jewish History, Culture, and Community. David, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you, Rachel. It's quite a job you have tonight, staying up all night and sitting through all these. Thank you for facilitating. Welcome, everyone, and congratulations all of you for staying up this late as well. Let me further introduce myself by saying that as a Jewish historian, the Torah that I have to teach, the Torah that I believe it's important for Jews to study in addition to the actual Torah, is the Torah of Jewish history. And within that, I specialize in the American Jewish historical experience. And within that, I'm focusing of late on the New York Jewish experience. And part of that is the really quite amazing range of different areas in which New York Jews have contributed to, have made their impact on, have asserted themselves in the general culture of New York and beyond. And what I've done is I'm in the process of writing a blog series on that subject, covering all those various areas. And what I'm sharing with you tonight is the PowerPoint version of that, going through a list of iconic, meaning famous or significant New York Jews, and tracing them through the alphabet. So I've chosen a figure for each particular letter, and that will give us a wide range of areas, as you'll soon see. But first, let me just say a word about New York. The basic fact about New York Jewish life is that for about 3 or 4 decades in the middle of the 20th century, from let's say the 1930s to the 1960s, New York held a Jewish population of about 2 million Jews. That represented about a quarter of the city of New York. That's to say 1 out of every 4 New Yorkers was Jewish. It was about 40% of all the Jews of the country living in just the one city of New York. And the reason that's important is that that enabled a certain, that density of population enabled and created a certain culture, a specific culture out of which we get the image of the New York Jew and all of the various achievements that we'll talk about tonight. So without further ado, let me go to the, there we go, let's see. Okay. All right, and let me just say off the bat that we probably won't get through the entire alphabet. I'll try to keep each entry relatively short. You can kind of play along and try to anticipate who's going to be my letter A, who would be a letter B, C, D, etc. I'll speak for 5 or so minutes on each one. Each one of them represents a larger field. So I'm not just talking about the individual, I'm talking about the field as well. And some of them represent more than one field. So we'll be able to touch a few different bases. The word Jewhooing, I should just briefly explain, is a word, I didn't make it up, but it means pointing out famous Jews, pointing to the Jews in the culture. Look how many Jews there are in the Supreme Court. Look how many Jews won Nobel Prizes, right? I mean, it's a common activity that we Jews engage in. I'm sure many of you have indulged in it at one point or another. And for me, it's important as a way to, first of all, raise the question of what is it about Jews that makes their conspicuous role in culture disproportionate. How do we explain that historically? And one of the answers that I'm bringing to bear is that there's something about New York. It's going to be, as you'll soon see, most of the figures that we think about when we think about iconic American Jews are in fact New York Jews, and that's not coincidental. So let's begin with the first figure, letter A. Anyone have an idea who that might be? Well, the answer is Bella Abzug. Bella Abzug, those of you of a certain age will remember, was a path-breaking politician She was a 3-term congresswoman in the 1970s, which made her part of a generation of women, along with Shirley Chisholm and a few others, a small number of others, who broke the glass ceiling of women in politics. And therefore, the Life magazine cover gives you a good idea of this area, the breaking down of that barrier, the breaking into politics. Bella Abzug is a very important figure. You see on the upper left-hand corner a couple of images from some of her campaigns. This in the top left is her campaigning for her first run for Congress. And the campaign motto, I don't know if you can make it out, but campaign motto says a lot about who she was, says a woman's place, a woman's place is in the House of Representatives, right? So she was very clearly embracing a feminist point of view. The fact of her womanhood was key to who she was and what she represented. She later ran for mayor, she ran for senator unsuccessfully, but as a congresswoman during the 70s is a very important figure, and subsequently becomes an iconic leading figure in the feminist movement writ large. So this, it's going to happen. This photo here shows her with some of her celebrity supporters: Diane Von Furstenberg, designer, Sephardic Jewish woman; Gloria Steinem, of course, another feminist leader. Her father was Jewish. Barbara Streisand, I'm pretty sure she was Jewish. I'm joking. Were some of the people who were very supportive of her, saw her as someone who was leading the way into a new world. Later on in her career, she would become, as I say, one of the matron saints of the feminist movement, leading the drive for the Equal Rights Amendment. But one of the image I love is this caricature by the artist David Levine, showing Bella as the Statue of Liberty, conflating the great New York Jewish woman politician with the icon of New York City as a haven for immigrants and the disenfranchised and so forth. It should be said that Bella is not only iconic for women in politics, but also for the feminist movement, as well as the basic idea of progressivism, of women who are going to join the political fray in order to work toward making a better world. So in the upper right-hand corner, there are 4 figures that some of you may have heard of, but I'm imagining most have not. This is Clara Lemlich, this is Rose Schneiderman, this is Pauline Newman, and this is Belle Moskowitz. And of course, I chose that photo because she, like Bella, loved to wear hats. 3 of these 4 women were immigrants. 3 of the 4 came out of the labor movement. All of them were deeply affected by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. 3 of the 4 of them became involved thereafter in the suffragist movement for the women's vote. And 3 of the 4, and the reason I keep saying 3 of the 4 is that there's always one exception. 3 of them later became heavily involved in New Deal politics. So this group of women are illustrative of that nexus between Jewish women's activism early in the century, especially in the frame of the labor movement, and it's the way it then translated into American politics, especially of the New Deal variety. Belle Moskowitz was Al Smith's right-hand man. Al Smith was part of FDR's Brain Trust. Pauline Newman worked directly with Francis Perkins, also part of the FDR circle. So it's an extraordinary legacy that Bella Abzug then takes up. And she, of course, becomes the first one to win electoral office. But her successors, Ruth Messenger and Liz Holtzman and others, are examples of how this is a kind of a tradition. Jewish women's activism translated into political empowerment. And finally, on the bottom, I added Bernie Sanders and AOC. Obviously, they're not New York Jewish women, but I'd like to think that if they had a love child, it would be Bella Abzug. All right, let's go on to B. Lenny Bruce, I chose for the subject of comedians. This is picking up on Moshe Waldach's earlier wonderful talk. Always love listening to Moshe. He really is the mumcha, the expert on the subject of Jewish humor. And he, those of you who were in that session, heard him describe how Jewish humor is of long-standing tradition in Jewish life. It's one way that Jews make fun of themselves. It expresses the outsider's perspective. It contains a lot of material about anti-Semitism, countering, fighting back against anti-Semitism. All those things are true. What Moshe did not talk about is that most of these figures that you see are New York Jews. There's a little photo here of Georgie Jessel, George Burns, and Eddie Cantor, and I cropped out Jack Benny because he was from Chicago, right? But everyone else here is a New Yorker, with one other exception, I have to be honest. Larry of the Three Stooges was from Philadelphia. But all of these other figures, and we could certainly add hundreds more, Jewish comedians were New York born and bred, and that is significant. There's something about the New York Jewish experience that gave these people a sense of comfort in who they were, the ability to express themselves, the lack of inhibition that enables one to stand on a stage and make people laugh. And finally, the one reason I choose Lenny Bruce as the iconic figure is his famous statement. This is part of the famous routine of his entitled Jewish and Goyish, which he contrasts Jewish and non-Jewish attributes. So he starts off by saying, dig it, man, I'm Jewish. Count Basie is Jewish. And as you all know, Count Basie was an African-American musician. What's he talking about? Ray Charles, same thing, is Jewish. Eddie Cantor, who we all know was a New York Jew, as well as all these others, Goyish. B'nai B'rith is Goyish. Hadassah, Jewish. And then he adds, if you live in New York City, and if you live in New York or any other big city, you are Jewish. It doesn't matter, even if you're Goyish, you're Jewish. If you live in Butte, Montana, you're going to be Goyish, even if you're Jewish. Right, so that's a famous statement of his, which has kind of become part of his legend. And the reason I share it with you is that it expresses, in a way that New York Jews immediately recognize, the level of at-homeness that they have experienced, especially during the heyday, as Jews in New York City. It's a place that feels like their city. It's their home. And as a result, New York becomes Jewish. And Jews who live here, by the same token, become New Yorkish, right? There's an overlap, an overlay of the city, the urban setting, and the Jewish experience. And these comedians, I want to suggest, are expressing that. Well, we could go much further with that, but Moshe did a much better job than I could ever do, certainly. Third figure for the letter C is the Yiddish newspaper editor, Abraham Cahan. Cahan is a figure of extraordinary importance in New York Jewish history, little remembered today, although I think he should be better remembered. He was the founding editor of the Daily Forwards, in English, the Jewish Daily Forward was the flagship, the leading Yiddish newspaper. There were about 5 or 6 major Yiddish newspapers at the height of the immigrant era. They had a circulation altogether of over 400,000 copies daily circulated, of which about half, around 200,000, was the Forwards. And the Forwards, under the leadership of Cahan, was an avowedly socialist Yiddish paper, right? And in the building you see here in this, this is the front page upon his retirement, and this is the building that was built in 1911. And again, in that building that housed not only the offices of the Forwards, but also of all the leading socialist Jewish organizations like the Workmen's Circle and others were housed in that building as well. It was the socialist center of the Lower East Side. So the paper was very left-wing, but it was also at the same, and it was in Yiddish. And at the same time, it was an instrument of Americanization. It was something that enabled, and this helps explain its popularity, it was something that enabled the immigrant to learn to become fully American. So for example, one of Cahan's innovations was the Bintel Brief column. It was an advice column that Jewish immigrants wrote into, asking all sorts of questions. What should I do with my landsmanship? I've got a problem at work. I've got this problem or that problem. And Cahan and his editorial staff would answer them as best they could. It was one of the pioneering early advice columns in the press. Now, Cahan deserves to be very well known for that alone, but he engaged in at least 2 other areas, or really I should say that as editor of the Forwards, he also should be seen in the context of this group on the left. These are all Jewish editors and publishers of major newspapers, general English newspapers in the city of New York, Cahan's influence was such, his journalistic sophistication was such that he deserves to be joined with these. The one I'll point out is this one here with the beard. That's Joseph Pulitzer, who at the end of the 19th century was the editor of the leading New York City paper. And then others follow him, Adolph Oakes, Rosenthal, the Times, Dorothy Shipp of the Post, Wallace Shawn of the New Yorker, etc. On the right is another category that Cahan belongs to. And these are all members of the famous group of novelists, writers, literary figures who burst on the scene in the post-World War II period. And they don't take over American literature, but their contribution to it is now legendary. And that includes people like Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, Grace Paley, Herman Wouk, Bernard Malamud, Oswald Singer, Cynthia Ozick, J.D. Salinger, etc. And Cahan is part of that as well, because Cahan, while serving as editor of the Forwards, also published novels and novellas and short stories in English for a general audience that were intended, if the Forwards was a way to bring America to the Jewish immigrant, his literary efforts were a way of bringing the world of the Jewish immigrant to the American public, to the American reading public. So he was a bridge figure. And as I say, deserving of much greater attention and a very important part of the New York Jewish story. Next, I hope this is working in terms of the pacing and so forth. Again, I will get through about half of the alphabet, and then I'll kind of move quickly through the rest of it, and then we'll open for questions. I'll be more than happy to talk about any of these figures or areas at much greater length. Lucy Davidovich is someone who also is relatively obscure nowadays, although she's the subject of a recent biography by my colleague Nancy Sinkoff. You see the book cover over here from left to right. The subtitle is Lucy Davidovich, the New York intellectuals, and I'm sorry, I can't read it. I don't remember. And the politics of Jewish history. Now, that's the point, is that Lucy Davidovich was a Jewish historian, and New York, it stands to reason, has been a center for the study of and the teaching of and the scholarship in Jewish history. Not surprising. The first important figure in Jewish history in America was this fellow on the upper left-hand corner, Selo Baron. He was appointed professor of Jewish history at Columbia University at a time when there were only 2 appointed professors in Jewish studies anywhere in the US. The other one was at Harvard, Harry Austin Wolfson in Jewish thought, and Baron at Columbia. And he establishes a tradition of Jewish historians. His student, Yosef Yerushalmi, both of whom were New Yorkers, by the way. Yerushalmi is a Jewish boy from the Bronx, is his successor at Columbia. And Yerushalmi is important for having written, amongst other things, for having written a small book called Zachor. Remember, thou shalt remember. And in that book, he argues that there's a tension in Jewish life between history, as he practiced it, and memory, the way that most Jews construct their idea of the Jewish past. And that is represented in the career of Lucy Davidovich. She often found herself midway between academic history and academic studies in general, and the concerns of the community and the life of ordinary Jews. And to her great credit, as a graduate student, she was a student of Baron's at Columbia, never finished her PhD, but she was certainly in that tradition. She decided in 1938 to travel to Vilna in Lithuania, where the YIVO Institute, that great repository of Yiddish literature and learning, to go and spend a year studying the life and literature of East European Jews. She got out of Eastern Europe just weeks before the Nazi invasion, so that part of her story is very dramatic. But in the course of that year, she developed a feel for that culture, which was decimated in the Holocaust together with the human lives, that she then spent the rest of her career researching and writing about. And so one of her classic works is right here, The War Against the Jews by Lucy Davidovich. It's somewhat outdated, but it is still used in college courses to this day. It was the second textbook or one-volume history of the Holocaust, the first being written by Raoul Hilberg up here, who wrote The Destruction of European Jewry, but that was primarily a forensic analysis of how the Nazis committed the crime. What Lucy Davidovich added was the experience of the victims. What was it like to be a Jew in the midst of that Nazi onslaught? That was her great contribution. And so up here on the right, I have Hannah Arendt and Elie Wiesel, who kind of represent the two poles. Again, the more academic versus the more communally minded. Lucy Davidovich really bridged those two worlds. And I could talk about some of these other figures as well, but let me go on. Will Eisner is now an echo. And again, I apologize, this is a little scattershot. There's no logical order to this. It's just following the alphabet. But I actually think there's a benefit to that. I'd love to hear people's thoughts at the end on that. For letter E, I've chosen Will Eisner, which brings us back to the last session, which was also wonderful by Roy Schwartz. I don't believe he mentioned the figure Will Eisner. Eisner was also an early seminal figure in comic book art and illustration, and the development of those early superheroes was very much part of that in the 30s and 40s. And over the course of his career, he mentored many, many, many others, so that at this point, those in that world, the world of comic book and cartooning and graphic novels and so forth, really see Eisner as this seminal figure who was really very important. From the Bronx, went to DeWitt Clinton High School, where oddly many cartoonists of note also went. And here are just some of the people that he mentored. This is Bob Kane, who created Batman. His original name was Robert Kahn. Stanley Lee, the founder and guiding force of Marvel Comics. His name was Stanley Lieber. The group at Mad Magazine were also people who were students and inspired by Will Eisner. Here's Harvey Kurtzman. Over here on the right is Jules Pfeiffer also. But what makes Eisner extraordinary is not only his role in the history of comic books and illustration. In his later years, in the late 70s, he actually innovates. He's not the only inventor, but he's the primary figure who introduces the term a graphic novel, which is essentially a comic book for adults on serious themes, paralleling a novel, but with illustrations. Today, it's a very important form of contemporary literature. Will Eisner is the founding father of that. And some of his students and proteges who continue in that vein will be Art Spiegelman with Mouse, Roz Chast, Jules Pfeiffer, and many, many others, all New York Jews as well. And by the way, this page could have dozens and dozens and dozens of other New York Jews whose names you would certainly recognize. But just to give you a taste of it, Will Eisner is really a central figure. And what's fascinating, and this also resonates with Roy's earlier presentation, so much of Will Eisner's his graphic novel output is on specifically Jewish themes. The pioneering graphic novel in 1978 is A Contract with God, which is about the old Bronx neighborhood he grew up in and introduces religious themes and so forth. And he'll later also add a graphic novel about the history of anti-Semitism and so forth. For the letter F, I go back a little bit further in history. Jews have been in New York since the 17th century, and this is a couple who were amongst the more memorable, noteworthy New York Jews in the early 1700s, the colonial period. Jacob and Abigail Franks. Jacob was the leading merchant of the city, and he was the Parnas, the president of the one Jewish congregation, the Sharith Israel, now known as the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue. This was the building. It is a reconstruction. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but this was more or less what the building looked like. That was built in 1730. When Jacob Franks was the Parnas, he would have led the consecration of this building, and his wife Abigail would have been sitting there quite proudly as well, looking down from the women's balcony, right? This is a map of New York City in those early days. You can see that the entire city was just the southern tip of Manhattan, the Wall Street area of today, quite a far cry from what it is today. Abigail is actually the more historically important of the two, in that she left behind a series of letters, correspondence between her and her children, who were sometimes off in England or elsewhere. And in particular, the very poignant story that is detailed in those letters of one of her daughters. You see two of her children in this portrait here. Her daughter, Phyla, had a young friend named Oliver Delancey of the noted Delancey family in New York, after which the name of the street named for them. Delancey Street was part of their would have been up in this area, the Delancey property. Oliver and Phyla eloped and to go off to marry because her family would not have approved of her marrying a non-Jew. And so in a certain sense, it's the beginning of a very long and very contemporary story of interfaith marriage. And so we have the mother's somewhat sorrowful response in her letters. So we have an insight into the inner world, the mind of a colonial Jew. And so Abigail Franks is a very important source for us. G brings us to a very extremely important area of New York Jewish life, and that is musical composition. And George Gershwin, others might say, well, what about Irving Berlin? Isn't he more iconic? Or Leonard Bernstein, isn't he more important? Well, one reason I chose Gershwin was that Gershwin really ties together the three interrelated areas of music composition. One is that together with his contemporary Irving Berlin, he gets his start. By the way, he grows up on the Lower East Side, up in Harlem. His family is continually moving around the city, so he really is a New York boy. Gershwin grows up together with Berlin, originally attempting to sell songs to the music publishers who constituted Tin Pan Alley on 28th Street. And so he was one of what were called song pluggers. These young kids who could play piano and could put together a tune and some lyrics, and were attempting to get the next hit, to create the next popular song. This is really the birth, or certainly one of the important origins of American popular music. And like Irving Berlin, who will go on to become the great figure of popular songs, Gershwin has his beginnings there as well. I mean, for example, the hit song, I believe in the year 1917 or 18, was Swanee, which Gershwin wrote together with his friend Irving Caesar. The two of them wrote it on the bus as they were riding uptown to the Gershwin's apartment in Harlem. They wrote this song about the American South called Swanee, sold it to a company who gave it to Al Jolson, who made it a huge hit. And the teenaged George Gershwin, that was his first taste of success. And he, of course, goes on from there with his, these are some other songwriters. This is Jerome Kern, Harold Arlen, both sons of Cantors. Then that's a story in itself, right? Which will later be translated into The Jazz Singer. But Gershwin, together with his brother, and here the two of them are, George and Ira Gershwin, will also, through the 1920s, be part of the development of a new art form called the Broadway musical. And they will co-author together a few dozen Broadway, every year they'll put out another one. Not all of them will be very successful. Very few of them will be memorable, but they're part of that incredible period of creativity of entirely New York Jews. This is Richard Rodgers and Larry Hart, the same Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, the young Stephen Sondheim and Leonard Bernstein, all part of co-authors, lyricists, and musical composers crafting these musicals. There are many others as well, Lerner and Lowe, Cobden and Green, the list goes on and on. But Gershwin is part of that milieu as well. But then, like his younger contemporary Leonard Bernstein, Gershwin also has higher aspirations to more sophisticated, more of a classical orientation toward music. And so he will his first early success is in 1924 with Rhapsody in Blue, which was written for symphonic orchestral, as a symphonic orchestral piece, aspiring to something beyond Tin Pan Alley or Broadway. Right, really attempting to create a new American music, and later that will culminate with his operetta Porgy and Bess, and that, in a nutshell, is the career of George Gershwin. But the point being is that it is a group of New York Jews who begin writing what today we call the American songbook. It's not 100% Jewish. It's not 100% New York, certainly, but there will be this burst of creativity on the part of New York Jews in the early part of the century. Gershwin is at the center of it, and tragically, he dies at the very young age of 39. So who knows what might have come had he lived a longer life. For the letter H, I've chosen the comedic actress Judy Holliday. And Judy Holliday is yet another figure who was extremely popular in her time. Her career was shortened also by health issues, but she is kind of, I'd suggest, the quintessential comedienne, the kooky, daffy, silly kind of persona created, the dumb blonde. She's the quintessential. Before Marilyn Monroe, she's the dumb blonde, right? Which, from an actress's point of view, there's an awful lot. Keep in mind, they're not playing themselves, right? They're all very sharp, intelligent women playing dumb. And whatever you want to read into that, it does to some degree become kind of a Jewish tradition. So the one who really starts it is Fanny Brice, down here in the lower, the lower left is Fanny Brice. The person that she directly inspired, Barbara Streisand, is part of that kooky Jewish comedienne tradition. But you also have Bette Midler, Madeline Kahn, Elaine May, Shelley Winters, Carol Kane, Gilda Radner, Fran Drescher, right, etc. I should point out Carol Kane is from Cleveland, I think, and Gilda Radner is from Detroit, but they moved to New York very quickly and they become part of that New York milieu. Judy Holliday captured something about New York. It wasn't specifically Jewish, right? There were many women who saw something of themselves in her in the 1950s. That was her heyday. Not only Jewish women, but the fact that it's primarily Jewish women who will capture that caricature and do wonderful things with it is, I think, in large measure thanks to Judy Holliday. And then for the letter I, okay. Letter I is a figure I doubt anyone's heard of. The Reverend Samuel Meyer Isaacs is a great example of someone who deserves to be better known for the simple reason that he is not only the first rabbi in New York, I argue he's the first rabbi in America. That title usually goes to a man named Abraham Rice, who was a very Orthodox rabbi who came as an immigrated to Baltimore in 1840, right? And that's the first rabbi in America. Keep in mind that Jews had been here for 2 centuries prior. So American Judaism develops in the total absence of rabbinic leadership for quite a long time. So it's an important moment when rabbis begin arriving, and Isaacs predates Rice by arriving in 1839, moving from, he's originally Dutch, but he and his family had been living in England. His father was a rabbi, 3 of his brothers were rabbis, and he was a Jewish teacher who had to some degree studied but hadn't received his ordination, his rabbinic smicha. So he's not officially a rabbi, but he will come first to serve B'nai Jeshurun, today more commonly known as BJ, and then a group of the original founders of BJ will split off and form their own congregation called Sha'arei Tefillah, and he will go with them, and he will be the rabbi of Sha'arei Tefillah for 3 or 4 decades. So he is one of the important early rabbis in New York City. This group on the left are all more or less contemporaries of his early New York City rabbis. This is Judah Jacques Leon of Shaarei Israel. This is Max Lillianthal, who was in the 1845 to 1855. He was deemed the chief rabbi of the German congregations of New York, German Jewish congregations. This is Samuel Adler, who was the rabbi of the Reformed Temple Emmanuel. And others. These two were locked in a debate over slavery that we could talk about. But Adler is interesting in that he groomed his son to follow in his footsteps. And so he sent young Felix down here on the lower left off to Europe to study for the rabbinate. You couldn't do that here in the States. While in Germany studying for the rabbinate, Felix discovered that he felt that Judaism was too provincial, parochial, ethnocentric. He wanted something more universal. And so he came back to the States. He gave one sermon at Emmanuel, immediately realized it wasn't for him. They realized the same, and he went off to found a new humanistic religion called ethical culture. That was Felix Adler, the son of Samuel. So that's just a side note. But Isaacs is certainly an important figure. We talk much more about him. He's one of 3 or 4 leading rabbis in New York during the Civil War years. His son, this is a picture of his son, Meyer Samuel Isaacs, goes on to become a leading lawyer and judge in New York City, as well as an important Jewish communal leader. And then his son, bottom right-hand corner, is Stanley Meyer Isaacs, who will serve on the city council of, begins as a lawyer, but goes into politics, serves on the city council for many years, including a stint as Manhattan Borough President. I mentioned Ruth Messenger earlier, also Manhattan Borough President. We'll have cause to mention another 1 or 2 of them as well. Isaacs is not only the progenitor of that distinguished New York Jewish family, but he's the one who begins what might be termed the New York City rabbinate. And so there's much more we could talk about with him, but let's move on. For the letter J, back to pop culture. Al Jolson is someone who is not well thought of nowadays. He was not the nicest person in the world. He also was known for putting burnt cork on his face and performing in blackface, and for obvious reasons, that's no longer well thought of. So Jolson's reputation has suffered to some degree. However, in his heyday, which was the 19-teens and 20s, he was billed. It was his own billing, but he lived up to it. He billed himself as the world's greatest entertainer. It can be said that Al Jolson was the first great American pop star. Right? Today we think about people like Justin Timberlake and Lady Gaga and so forth. He was really the first person that stood on a stage and mostly sang, but also danced, told jokes, whatever, and held an audience rapidly. And he was a revolutionary figure for the way in which he injected emotionalism and intensity into his performances. People had never seen the like of it. And so he skyrocketed to fame and was part of a group of other similar, of the same era, also Jewish immigrants in New York who attained such heights as stage performers. Here he is in the upper left-hand corner with this is Irving Berlin, that's Eddie Cantor, that's Sophie Tucker, and that's George Burns. Also in a similar vein, he was particularly friendly with Eddie Cantor, who was kind of a number 2 to him in terms of fame. Fanny Brice was the other great figure of that era, who also became extraordinarily successful and famous. And here on the bottom right, I have a group of New York Jewish boys who will, whether consciously or not, will aspire to be another Jolson. Neil Diamond was quite conscious, intentional about that. He made no bones about wanting to follow in the footsteps of Jolson. For example, he will star in his own version of The Jazz Singer, which was probably the best known film vehicle for Jolson, 1927. But these other figures, Neil Sedaka, Barry Manilow, Billy Joel, etc., also can be seen in the same light. And again, I don't want to push it too far, but the fact that they are New Yorkers is part of their persona and may help explain some of what motivated them and what gave them their success. Okay, for the letter K, my book is called Jewhooing the 60s. I've already talked about Lenny Bruce as one of the figures I discussed. Barbara Streisand is another figure I discussed. I also talk about Sandy Koufax, who I have great love for. And so I was very tempted to plug in Koufax here. The problem with Koufax is that as great a figure as he is, Brooklyn Jewish boy, he doesn't really represent a larger cohort of people that went into the same field, right? There was an entire generation of New York Jews who reached that kind of level of success in professional sports. Earlier on, one might have been able to say that about basketball and boxing in the 30s and 40s. There was a heavy Jewish representation, but by Koufax's time, it was the exception to the rule. On the other hand, someone like Stanley Kubrick is going to make his mark in 2 areas, both of which will see heavy Jewish achievement And in almost every case, it's a New York Jew. So here he is in the upper left-hand corner as a young street photographer, right? Taking pictures on the street for the magazines of the day, as was Arthur Weegee, Robert Frank, Richard Avedon, Diane Arbus, all New York Jews who were photographers, and there are many, many others. This is just a small representative sampling. And then, of course, as is better known, Kubrick goes on to become one of the major American film directors of the 1960s and 70s. And here we have figures like Sidney Lumet and John Frankenheimer and Paul Mazursky and Martin Ritt. And once again, Elaine May becomes an important director in her own right. So there is a group, especially in that period, again, the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, when New York Jews, having grown up in New York, having been shaped by that experience, go off, in this case, to Hollywood to make their mark in the greater world. How are we doing for time? Okay, 1:11. All right, let me begin moving a little bit more quickly. For L, I've got Emma Lazarus, a very well-known figure. You all are certainly familiar with her great contribution to in having written the poem that is on the base, adorns the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, you're poor. It is classic work, certainly, and her fame is well deserved. What's a little bit less known about her is that she comes from a very important Sephardic family in New York, going back to the period prior to the Revolution. Her great-great-grandmother, up in the upper left-hand corner, was named Grace Mendes Satius Nathan. And that is her great-great-grandmother and a progenitor of the Nathan family, which will be one of those important Sephardic families of whom we have many other important members. Grace's brother was Gershom Mendes Satius. He was the first important chazan, spiritual leader of Shaarith Israel. Some other descendants will be Annie Nathan Meyer, her sister Maud Nathan. This is the young Annie Nathan Meyer, the older one. As a young girl, she attends classes at Columbia, but is not able to get a degree since they don't officially allow women to be students. So she will later become one of the founders of Barnard College, right? A school for which becomes one of the seven sisters Ivy League schools for women. Interestingly enough, the two sisters were on different sides of the suffragist movement, but that's another story. And then down below, we have two other members of the Nathan family, both important judges in New York. One was named Edgar Nathan, one Benjamin Nathan Cardozo. Cardozo becomes the Supreme Court Justice. Edgar Nathan becomes Manhattan Borough President, right? So that was the other MVP for us today. On the right-hand side, we have a number of New York City poets, and this is a much longer story, but just to give you a little taste, Allen Ginsberg, his father, Louis Ginsberg, was a teacher, but also a poet, an aspiring poet as well. Adrian Rich was a New York Jewish poet, and I threw in Bob Dylan and Paul Simon on the bottom just to kind of give you a sense of Emma Lazarus being a part of that context of the history, tradition of poetry written by New York Jews. It's an extraordinary tradition that we could talk at much greater length about. For M, I have two M's, a rabbi and a lawyer. So Judah Magnus represents a group of rabbis, as well as Henrietta Zold, founder of Hadassah, on the left. And on the right, Louis Marshall. Here we have a group of very significant lawyers and judges in New York City. And the two, I could go into great length. Magnus and Marshall were also brothers-in-law. They helped to co-found the New York Kehillah, which was the umbrella organization of the Jewish community that lasted from 1909 to 22. Fascinating story. And the fact that it brought together a rabbi and a lawyer, someone from the religious sphere, someone from the secular sphere, to work in tandem is significant, is a particularly New York Jewish story. And along those lines, I'll point out Stephen S. Wise, not only an important rabbi of the 20th century, but an extremely important progressive social crusader. His daughter is Justine Wise Pollier, who becomes a path-breaking New York City judge, and she's here on the right. Okay, let's continue. For the letter N, I have Louise Nevelson, artist, part of the group of New York Jews who were important members of the abstract expressionist school in the 1950s and 60s. And so you have other figures such as Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Adolf Gottlieb, Lee Krasner. Louise Nevelson is part of that group. That was about what I just said was about half of the abstract expressionists, the probably most famous one being Lee Krasner's husband, Jackson Pollock. But Louise Nevelson is also important for her sculpture, her statuary work, and in particular, the way in which she was an important figure in the introduction of public art into the New York, the urban cityscape. And so Louise Nevelson is was a Jewish, Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrant when she first arrived. Lives quite a long life. This is a self-portrait of hers here. Fascinating figure, and wanted to get the arts in. Speaking of the arts, we have Clifford Odette, extremely important playwright of the 1930s and 40s. He begins as a member of the group theater, the method acting, right? The Stanislavski method. He's part of that group, and then goes on to write some of the critical. He's seen as a kind of a successor to Eugene O'Neill, and he will later inspire other figures like Arthur Miller and Paddy Chayefsky and others. This is George S. Kaufman, Moss Hart, Lillian Hellman, Arthur Lorenz, Neil Simon, Wendy Wasserstein, Larry Kramer, Tony Kushner, right? Some other great New York City Jewish playwrights. Odette's is the seminal figure here, however. Molly Pecon brings us back a little bit further to the Yiddish theater. And here, again, Moshe Waldach's mentioned this briefly, the degree to which the Yiddish theater will flow into American show business and entertainment across the board is, I believe, is yet to be fully explored. The ties between the influence of the Yiddish theater in New York and American show business. Molly Pecon is one of those figures who begins in the world of the Yiddish theater and then becomes very well known on Broadway and in Hollywood film. Probably most famously as Yentl in, or the Yenta, sorry, not Yentl, to be distinguished, in Fiddler on the Roof here, but she also was in a film with Barbra Streisand, with this play, How to Be a Jewish Mother, most famously Yidel with the Fiddle, which was kind of a basis for Yentl with Barbra Streisand. We can go on. Also on here, I've got Boris Tomaszewski, David Kessler, other figures from the Yiddish theater. Great story to be told. Molly Pecon, also wonderful, wonderful life story. Let me go quickly now. Julia Richman, a key figure in New York City public education, the first woman to be superintendent of a public school district, happened to be in the Lower East Side. So as an uptown German Jew, she's going downtown to work with the immigrant Jewish population, and as such becomes very involved in the Education Alliance and with various other educational efforts to help the immigrant community adjust and Americanize and so forth. I added Al Shanker and Randy Weingarten because they're kind of well-known figures, but leading figures in public education is, again, another incredible story. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the majority of public school teachers in New York City, and especially principals, were all Jewish. And so the role of Jews in public education is a story into itself, and Julia Richman is kind of the indicator of that. For the letter S, I'm giving a couple of examples of our crowd, the uptown German Jewish financiers, department store magnates, wealthy upper crust aristocracy called our crowd. One thing I realized that many of them happen to be named S. Who's not here is Sachs of Goldman Sachs, Spire, and a couple of others as well. But Seligman, Schiff, and Strauss are three of the more famous members of that. And it occurred to me at some point that if you take the letter S and put it in front of our crowd, you get sauerkraut. And that points to the fact that they were all German-speaking, German-identified. Many of them were highly assimilated, but these three all had a Jewish story as well. And for lack of time, we won't be able to tell that. T is Richard Tucker, who covers two bases, both New York Cantors, you see on the left. He was someone that was being advertised at the Concord Hotel in the Catskills. This says Richard Tucker. for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, together with Sholem Secunda, right? They were the main attractions. That's Yosela Rosenblatt up there. And Tucker is very much in that tradition, but he also becomes a star of the Metropolitan Opera, together with figures like Beverly Sills and Jan Pierce and Robert Merrill and Roberta Peters, become stars of the New York City opera scene. And the fact that they're local Jewish boys and girls is fascinating. And so there's a story there as well. Bella Underberg is someone I doubt anyone knows, but for the letter U, I had very few choices. I chose Bella because she was the founder of the Young Women's Hebrew Association. She was a part of a group of Jewish women, social workers and activists at the turn of the century who were innovating and creating new kinds of institutions for the Jewish immigrants and their children. The YWHA becomes a landmark institution in what was a second very important immigrant enclave in Harlem. And in fact, its building on 110th Street overlooking Central Park still stands to this day. It's now a jail, but the old YWHA is still there. And once again, it's a fascinating history, and Bella Underberg was its leading light. For the letter V, I chose Abe Vegota, who is probably best known for his role as an Italian mafioso in The Godfather. But he was also very well known for his more Jewish role of Lieutenant Fish on Barney Miller. And here you see him with Hal Linden, fellow Jewish actor, fellow Jewish character, right, on that show, two Jewish cops. And Vegota represents to me a really interesting figure, which is the Jewish character actor, as opposed to the leading actor, the lead, who plays a Jewish role. And that's a particular type. And so, yeah, I have Elliot Gould and Jacoby and Richard Benjamin and Jed Hirsch, a number of others here on the right, Richard Kind, Jerry Orbach, and others who represent that Jewish actor who plays Jewish. And that raises all sorts of interesting issues. Is what does it mean to look Jewish, first of all? What does it mean to play Jewish? If you as an actor are given the role, okay, you're a Jewish person, how do you interpret that? How do you infuse that character with Jewishness? Well, the obvious answer is you make them very New York, right? And that goes to this group. And we're almost at the end. Lillian Wald, a very important social and healthcare reformer, you see, the founder of the Henry Street Settlement. Talk more about Jews and healthcare. Rosalind Yalow won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1977. This is the Nobel Prize, the Nobel winner's monument behind the Museum of Natural History. You see her name here, 1977. And finally, for Z, I've got the Zabar family and the Jewish role in food provision, not just Jewish food, but food in general in New York City is also of great significance. And I've got for you Ratner's and the famous dairy restaurant and Katz's Deli, the Second Avenue Deli, and Barney Greengrass as well, in addition to Zabar's. Okay, so we can stop the share. And I went over time a little bit in my great enthusiasm, but I'm happy to take questions and comments.
He likes to clearly have about 1 minute for questions, but if someone has a question, you can drop it in the chat, and I guess we'll take one question for tonight. But I'm impressed that we got through Z.
I'm impressed too.
Anyone have a question? Someone asked for the book title again. And
the book title Jewhooing the 60s is a book that came out a number of years ago that's on Jewish celebrity in the early 1960s. That's a related book, but that wasn't the topic tonight. This may be a future book. We'll see. It's going to be a blog series, so look for it online over the next year or so.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight, David. This was excellent.
Thank you
touched
so much
on my undergraduate thesis a little bit there too.
Great. That's great.
So for everyone who is still awake, thank you so much for being here. Thank you.